Nadine Strossen, and she is a legendary advocate for free speech and civil liberties. She is the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School and the past president of the ACLU from 1991 to 2008. Under her leadership, the ACLU expanded its work on issues ranging from free speech and privacy to gender equality and immigration rights. She's a senior fellow at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. She'll be talking about her role there in just a bit. She's testified on before Congress on numerous occasions. She's on the various advisory boards, including the Heterodox Academy. She has won more honorary degrees and awards that we can mention. The National Law Journal once named her one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. And she's the author of numerous important books, including Defending Pornography in 1995 and Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, which was published in 2023. And her most recent book is The War on Words, and it's co-authored with Greg Lukianoff, who is the president of FIRE, and we're giving away free copies, so please pick up one on your way out. What's the other book that we have?
And
You have the Academic Freedom book
Yes.
by Erwin Chemerinsky
That's
and Laura
right.
Gilman.
That's right. And we have some Heterodox Academy magazines. Our magazine is called Inquisitive. So please take copies of each of those things on your way out the door. One interesting thing about Nadine that I learned at lunch is that she has had friendships and personal relationships with numerous Supreme Court justices across the ideological spectrum. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's known a Supreme Court justice, and she's known a bunch of them. And although I wouldn't normally mention this in a speaker's introduction, I've chatted briefly with Nadine at a couple of conferences. And as I mentioned, we just had lunch, and she is an extraordinarily gracious person with appealing personal qualities. And we are super honored to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much, John. You're fun to have lunch with, too.
Thank you. We're seated a little bit far apart because if these microphones get too close, they interfere with each other. So I'm going to ask Nadine 3 or 4 questions, and then we have a couple representatives from campus groups who we put in line to ask questions, but then there'll be time, we'll open it up for everyone. Obviously, Nadine, we invited you months ago, and knowing that you would have a lot to share, but we didn't anticipate that you would be speaking at a time that is wrenching in the period, wrenching period in the history of free speech in the United States. In the New York Times today, as of about an hour ago, there were three articles on the front page dealing with issues of speech and expression in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. He was shot 8 days ago on a college campus in front of 3,000 college students while exercising his constitutionally protected right to free speech. We know that the killing was politically motivated, and in the aftermath there have been condemnations and recriminations and cancellations, and even on the fringes of youth celebrations. The Trump administration is involved. J.D. Vance has weighed in. Pam Bondi seems to misunderstand some crucial elements of the First Amendment. And it's a fast-moving situation, and even though I've had several days to think about the first question, I don't know how to phrase it except to say that we have some professors and students and some campus leaders here, and I was just wondering how you would advise people to think about this event and how to proceed moving forward.
Oh, thank you so much, John. And I would really like to thank John and Andrew, who have just been working so hard, it seems to me, for quite a while to put this together. And I'd like to thank you for your leadership of the Heterodox chapter here, your leadership of free speech and academic freedom on this campus, and for your work in setting up this event. Your school, by the way, has done quite well in the FIRE rankings. We'll talk about that. So not well, but you know what? It's all relative. We'll get to that. I said quite well, and I give credit to those of you who are interested enough to be here. Thank you for putting the school on the right trajectory. And in your honor, I'm wearing the closest I can to you. I've got one of your school colors white, and this is sort of blue. That's what I aim for. So to comment on this sorry situation, obviously any kind of violence on campus can have a profoundly chilling effect on free speech. Not only the speech of speakers who may be controversial or fear that they're perceived as controversial and therefore have a reasonable fear that they may be subject to violence. So in that sense, campus safety is actually a free speech issue. James and I, your student body president, were chatting in advance, and he told me that a major issue when he and others ran for president here was campus security. And by protecting security, you are providing the necessary environment. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary to ensure that there is free speech. By the way, I myself talk almost exclusively about free speech and academic freedom, which I do not see as controversial issues, but I have to tell you, according to very recent surveys, free speech continues to be viewed on campus as a highly controversial issue. FIRE's most recent survey, which was released just last week, the largest that's ever been done, it was conducted by College Pulse. 70,000 students were surveyed, statistically significant samples at 257 schools. And one of the questions they were asked was a number of topics, important topics were listed, topics of current interest, and students were asked, can you have a frank and candid conversation on your campus about this topic? And with respect to free speech, I was shocked. Only 20% said that they could have a frank and candid conversation about free speech. We're talking about in classrooms, and we're talking about in public spaces on campus. We're talking about places where students congregate. So I guess I should be realistically fear that I could be subject to disruption or violence, and that's a serious concern. The day after the assassination, I was, as usual, going to be speaking on a campus, and for the first time ever in my experience, I received a call in advance from the chief of the campus police, and he asked me whether I still wanted to speak. And yes, I did, and I really respected that he reached out to me to make sure that I could feel secure. Now, as if that actual violence did not have enough of a chilling impact, the reaction to the violence is perpetuating and escalating the chilling effect, because we have had, I think the word that first springs to my mind, quite frankly, is witch hunts to target individuals who, according to the critics and the complainers, are not expressing appropriate views in response to the killing. So some comments, as John said, have even been celebratory of the murder. Others have simply criticized particular views that have been uttered by Charlie Kirk or supported by his Turning Point USA organization. And others, I think, were criticized because they were not sufficiently condemnatory of the murder. And what's happened is, in addition to the social sanctions that you mentioned, John, there have been a large number of firings and suspensions already, not only of private sector employees and they have no First Amendment rights vis-a-vis their employers. Maybe we could get into the legalities later, but even university professors with tenure on public universities which are bound to respect the First Amendment rights of their faculty members have been summarily fired without any due process or without any free speech. So that, of course, adds further to the chilling impact, meaning that discussion, this very kind of discussion that you and I are having, is being chilled in many, many important institutions, including educational institutions and K through 12, as well as at the university level. But whatever you think about Charlie Kirk, I certainly did not know him personally. I knew of Turning Point USA for a sorry reason, that it was constantly and regularly subject to censorship of various kinds on campuses, either overt official suppression or cancel culture type pressures, attempts to deplatform and to shout down Turning Point USA speakers. So I knew that their views were controversial. But I also knew that they were engaging in exactly the kind of robust dialogue that it is Heterodox Academy's purpose to promote, that it is FIRE's purpose to defend, and it is my view, not only as a civil libertarian, but as an educator, that it is the kind of exchange of ideas that is essential for us to approach the truth, to come as close as we inherently limited human beings can to approaching truth in every field. And that is especially important on our campuses, not only in terms of our own educational experiences, but also for society as a whole. The United States Supreme Court has said that academic freedom, the robust, unfettered exchange of ideas and perspectives, is a special concern of the First Amendment, not only for the benefit of students and faculty members, members of the campus community, but for our society as a whole. We campuses fulfill a special niche in our society. And if we are afraid of everything, of adverse consequences, ranging from social ostracism to loss of our jobs, to loss of our lives. These are severe adverse consequences. Our education and our democracy are going to be profoundly undermined.
One more question about Charlie Kirk, or his organization rather. Turning Points USA puts out what they call a professor watch list. And its supposed mission is to expose and document college professors who discriminate against conservative students and advance leftist propaganda in the classrooms. That's a quote. And I've examined the list, and many people are on it for reasons that I think are trivial, and they appear unfairly perhaps on the list. But I've also seen statements on the list from professors that strike me as incredibly wrong-headed and distasteful. And so there's one school of thought that says people should be responsible for what they say. Mm-hmm. And if someone says something that's misguided or in poor taste, there's value in letting people know about it. Another school of thought says that these types of lists are designed really to silence and intimidate. They can lead to professors being harassed. Some professors have said that they have been harassed, mm-hmm. and I believe that. Mm-hmm. What is your view about these types of lists? You know,
it ties in directly to the kinds of lists that are being compiled now in the aftermath of the Kirk assassination, right? Because we've had individuals, and even more disturbingly government officials, encouraging people to hunt out comments that they consider to be adverse. It's a very complicated question from a free speech perspective, because there are free speech concerns on both sides. And this is why the debate about so-called cancel culture has been so fraught, because exercising or complaining, first of all, looking for information about faculty members who are conducting important jobs, as I just discussed. You know, they're important not only to their students, but to society as a whole, by transparency and accountability and information and discussion, including critical discussion, is very important. It is an essential manifestation of free speech. And I've heard from, just yesterday I was speaking on a campus where a couple students who identified themselves as conservative talked about how useful they found the Turning Point USA professor watch list. Not that they had any intent of calling out the professor or saying anything publicly about the professor, but that they considered it a warning system of professors who would not be fair to students who had conservative perspectives. And in fairness, studies have been done, including one recently, that show a shockingly high percentage of students say that they cover up what their true beliefs and views are. They hide them. They don't disclose them either in class discussion or in writing exams or writing papers because they fear that the professor is going to discriminate against them. And so this student was saying that was a useful function of this watch list, that I could get some advice about which professors I could feel that I could be candid in expressing my views. Very sad, but that's a positive use. Now, of course, as with any form of exposure or criticism, for that matter, any form of speech, it can be used for negative purposes as well as positive purposes. And if it is used not so much for information, but in a more destructive way, a more punitive way, not for its educational value, as in the anecdote I just shared, but rather to seek to punish professors, especially if those calling for punishment have government power. And that, I don't think that happened with Turning Point USA's professor watch list, or at least I've never heard that, as opposed to the situation we're seeing now, where you do have government officials, I think J.D. Vance, among others, expressly urging members of society to ferret out negative statements that were made by faculty members, not apparently for any educational benefit, but rather for purposes of political punitiveness. And we have to strike a delicate balance. I think that, so I have absolutely no doubt, FIRE has written articles, Chronicle of Higher Education has had articles, that some people on the watch list were there unfairly, without due process, suffered consequences.
To expose and document college professors who discriminate against conservative students and advance leftist propaganda in the classrooms. That's a quote. And I've examined the list, and many people are on it for reasons that I think are trivial, and they appear unfairly perhaps on the list. But I've also seen statements on the list from professors that strike me as incredibly wrong-headed and distasteful. And so there's one school of thought that says people should be responsible for what they say, and if someone says something that's misguided or in poor taste, there's value in letting people know about it. Another school of thought says that these types of lists are designed really to silence and intimidate. They can lead to professors being harassed. Some professors have said that they have been harassed, and I believe them. What is your view about these types of lists?
You know, it ties in directly to the kinds of lists that are being compiled now in the aftermath of the Kirk assassination, right? Because we've had individuals, and even more disturbingly government officials, encouraging people to hunt out comments that they consider to be adverse. It's a very complicated question from a free speech perspective, because there are free speech concerns on both sides. And this is why the debate about so-called cancel culture has been so fraught, because exercising or complaining, first of all, looking for information about faculty members who are conducting important jobs, as I just discussed. You know, they're important not only to their students, but to society as a whole. By transparency and accountability and information and discussion, including critical discussion, is very important. It is an essential manifestation of free speech. And I've heard from, just yesterday I was speaking on a campus where a couple students who identified themselves as conservative talked about how useful they found the Turning Point USA professor watch list. Not that they had any intent of calling out the professor or saying anything publicly about the professor, but that they considered it a warning system of professors who would not be fair to students who had conservative perspectives. And in fairness, studies have been done, including one recently, that show a shockingly high percentage of students say that they cover up what their true beliefs and views are. They hide them. They don't disclose them either in class discussion or in writing exams or writing papers because they fear that the professor is going to discriminate against them. And so this student was saying that was a useful function of this watch list, that I could get some advice about which professors I could feel that I could be candid in expressing my views. Very sad, but that's a positive use. Now, of course, as with any form of exposure or criticism, for that matter, any form of speech, it can be used for negative purposes as well as positive purposes. And if it is used not so much for information, but in a more destructive way, a more punitive way, not for its educational value, as in the anecdote I just shared, but rather to seek to punish professors, especially if those calling for punishment have government power. And that, I don't think that happened with Turning Point USA's professor watch list, or at least I've never heard that, as opposed to the situation we're seeing now, where you do have government officials, I think J.D. Vance among others, expressly urging members of society to ferret out negative statements that were made by faculty members, not apparently for any educational benefit, but rather for purposes of political punitiveness. And we have to strike a delicate balance. I think that, so I have absolutely no doubt, Fire has written articles, Chronicle of Higher Education has that articles, that some people on the watch list were there unfairly, without due process, suffered consequences that were not warranted. But I think we should not dismiss as categorically illegitimate the notion of empowering people to gather information and share information.
I've always thought that, well, the strongest argument for free speech hasn't changed in a very long time. It's the idea that in the marketplace of ideas, the good ideas will triumph over the bad ones. And you address this in your book, but maybe you can share your thoughts. My concern is that in the digital age, I wonder if that argument is outdated. We live in an era of disinformation and misinformation and deep fakes and malevolent actors online. We have bots, we have the social media fever swamps, where the level of discourse is, deplorable. And I'm just wondering if you think that maybe one of the big arguments on behalf of free speech is, as I say, perhaps becoming outdated in this new digital age.
With the greatest respect to you, John, because I know you understand this distinction. So the Supreme Court has never said, free speech advocates, to my knowledge, have never said that the free marketplace of ideas will lead to truth. No, 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 no. If you go back to the original statement from Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said the best test of truth is basically exposure to debate and discussion in the marketplace of ideas. He didn't say it would lead to truth, but he said it is much more likely to lead us haltingly and, inconsistently to approximate truth, much more so than government censorship, centralized control. And this is a profound argument in favor of free speech, or maybe it's more accurate to say against censorship, with respect to every kind of speech that is potentially harmful, whether it be disinformation or misinformation, whether it be hate speech, whether it be extremist speech or terrorist speech. One of the myths that we respond to in this book is the myth that those of us who defend free speech, including most importantly Supreme Court justices, say that speech can do no harm. No, that is absolutely not true. We recognize that speech can do a great deal of harm. In one of the Supreme Court's most recent decisions upholding freedom of speech for a very controversial form of speech, namely hateful speech against Catholics, against gay people, against members of the military, basically against everybody who was not a member of this particular little sect. Some of you may have heard of it, the Westboro Baptist Church. The Supreme Court said, we defend free speech not despite the fact that it causes harm or can cause harm, but precisely because of that fact. Speech has power, and it is power that can do a great deal of harm as well as a great deal of good. And the reason why we defend free speech is that it is the least bad option. The worst option is empowering the government to decide which hateful speech should be suppressed, which so-called disinformation should be suppressed, which so-called extremist speech. And I'm saying so-called because these are all inherently subjective concepts, right? John, I know that you are aware of this, and so again, you're asking a devil's advocate kind of questions, but even the concept of disinformation, think of how differently that term is used by different people. Starting with the fact that some people, like Donald Trump, use the term fake news. And what he calls fake news, including stuff that he just sued the New York Times about for a record amount of money, other people consider to be completely true, and vice versa. Let me give you one very prominent example. It's Black Lives Matter advocacy, which many of us consider to be true and virtuous and important and promoting of peace, promoting of justice, promoting of love, in the tradition of Martin Luther King, whom I associate very much with this special city. And yet, Black Lives Matter advocacy has been attacked by important government officials all across this country as hate speech against white people, hate speech against police officers. It's been attacked as extremist speech and terrorist speech for allegedly causing violence. It's been attacked as disinformation. A couple of important Republican officials, among others, have argued that Black Lives Matter is really a Marxist group, and so everything that they say about racial justice is supposedly disinformation. So the long answer to your question, or the short version of the long answer, is that the marketplace of ideas may not lead us to truth. That's a gamble. It may lead us closer and closer to truth, but censorship certainly will not lead us to truth.
All right, thank you. The last question for me before we open it up is I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about the HxA Campus Free Speech Survey. It came out last week and it was on the board. We're sort of in the middle of the pack. We're 132nd out of 257 schools that were surveyed, but I mentioned the tough graders that gave us an F. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about in more detail what the survey says, what its recommendations are, and how we could proceed if we wanted to get a higher rank.
Terrific. And I see that your esteemed provost has joined us. I'm very honored. Thank you for joining us. And if I can say this, part of the reason why FIRE started doing these surveys and rankings 6 years ago was because of a general refusal of many people, including university presidents and provosts and faculty members and students, a refusal to acknowledge that there was a free speech problem on their campuses. And if you want to solve a problem, the first thing you have to do is diagnose it and acknowledge that it's there. And some of you are experts in psychology, including you, Andrew, so this won't surprise you. University presidents and provosts are typical in answering surveys that they think that the free speech climate on other campuses in general is bad, but on their own campuses it's really good. And that's why FIRE started doing these surveys for each campus of its own student body, not at all in a punitive effort, but exactly the opposite, as a hopeful first step to collaborating with those campuses to take steps, many of which are very easily taken, that can quite quickly improve the free speech terrain, and and to work with individual campuses to do their own campus climate surveys to augment the ones that were done by College Pulse on behalf of FIRE. So coincidentally, the same day that the FIRE survey came out last week, Inside Higher Education had an article about, it was a preview of its latest survey of provosts. I don't know if you were one of the provosts that they surveyed for it. Of the question, how is the campus climate for free speech in general? Is it how, and 16% of all the provosts surveyed said that in general, in higher education, the campus climate for free speech was good or excellent. And good, so 16% said that is good or excellent at other schools. But as to your own school, is it good or excellent? 68% said that it was. So there's kind of a disconnect there. And in all seriousness, your school did really well, because I know an F grade sounds bad, but there's not grade inflation. So this is using the classic taxonomy. And I actually had to look it up because we have grade inflation at my law school. And of the 257 schools that were ranked, a full 2/3 of them got F grades. And the school that was the highest, Claremont McKenna, where I'm speaking next week, they're proud of being number one, but they shouldn't be that proud, because they basically had let's see, I'm sorry, I don't want to understate this. They basically had a C+, and that was only through rounding up. They basically had a C. And so as FIRE's survey concludes, it's not that they were so good, it's just that everybody else is so bad. Your school.
Interject real quick on that point. A critic is going to say, if 2/3 of the schools got Fs and the A was really a gentleman's C+, they're going to think that the survey was methodologically flawed, or the standards were too high.
Please. So FIRE's, it's a very, very transparent effort, completely consistent with academic freedom. You can easily find the rankings with all of the backup data, all of the methodology laid out, easily available on websites. There is a summary of what the methodology is, the elements that go into it. And at the bottom of each school's page, as I'm sure you saw, John, I'm looking at the one for your fine school. If you are a school administrator and would like to discuss your rating, reach out to. And it's not at all in a defensive fashion. Sean Stevens, who's the director of this whole research team, a data scientist, said, we want to work with faculty members and administrators, look item by item. We want you to be able to poke holes in our research, because what we're striving for is accuracy. And the goal is to have every school be qualified for an A+. You did so much better than all of the Ivy Leagues. My husband teaches at Columbia, which for the first time in 3 years was not the absolute bottom, it was second from the bottom, because the sister college of Barnard across the hall was the absolute bottom. But you actually did quite well in a very important area, which was students' comfort in expressing ideas, something I referred to earlier. But let me link this back to, on the methodology, it's all above board, it's very granular. The elements that go into it are not only the student survey, and by the way, that is given a fairly low amount of weight of the total grade for this reason, that FIRE thinks that it's unfair, and the data scientists that it works with, unfair to blame the college, if you will, the university, for aspects that are not directly controllable by them. So the reason why students don't speak up may very well have to do with their own psychology and not necessarily something that the campuses can control. Those elements that the campus can control are given higher weightings, and those include policies, including free speech policies. Some of you may know there is a very crude grading system: green light, yellow light, and red light. There are relatively few campuses that have the green light rating, which means no express policies that stifle speech that should be protected. Many schools have a red light, so you could tell I'm a glass half full but can't half full kind of person here. You have the yellow light rating, which means that there are a couple policies that are inconsistent with free speech standards, and those could easily be changed. Dartmouth College is the one Ivy League that has done well, and the reason is from one year to the next, Dartmouth got a new president, Sian Daylock. I had the privilege of meeting her, and in her inaugural address, she said, free speech and academic freedom and stimulating vibrant discourse at this campus is my priority. And they contacted FIRE to work with FIRE to revise policies, in addition to revamping their free speech policies to earn the green light, which is not just for the sake of the rating, it's for the sake of the educational experience of students and the academic freedom opportunities of faculty members. The other two policies that are really important that can instantly raise you from an F to a C minus, Sean explained this to me, is if you adopt some version of the Chicago free speech principles and some version of institutional neutrality. Basically, the same principles that are reflected under First Amendment law, and a policy of leaders of the university not speaking out on controversial public policy issues in order to encourage maximum discussion and debate and expression of views on those issues by members of the campus community, right? If students or faculty members believe that if their views are inconsistent with official.
In thinking about the institutional neutrality, I've worked for several presidents who've tried to have some level of that and have certain levers that have to sort of be flipped in order to make a statement about certain activities. But one of the things that I've found of late is that when things happen, the faculty want to hear from you. The students want to hear from you. And so how can institutions balance the idea that I mean, because I do believe that as soon as the university makes a statement, because I've watched it happen, and I've watched a president, fight over this word or that word, only to piss off a third of the people anyway. But how do you balance the fact that people oftentimes are coming to you saying, I want to hear from my department chair, I want to hear from my colleagues, I want to hear from the provost or the dean or the president, and yet having the neutrality might actually be the thing that allows the freest opportunity across the campus.
Yeah, you answered your own question, Madame Provost. Thank you so much for being here. I'm much older, so I remember the institutional neutrality. Basically, the same principles that are reflected under First Amendment law and a policy of leaders of the university not speaking out on controversial public policy issues in order to encourage maximum discussion and debate and expression of views on those issues by members of the campus community, right? If students or faculty members believe that if their views are inconsistent with official pronouncements that have come out from leaders of the institution, they're going to be chilled in exercising their free speech rights. And then the other factor that's considered, and I didn't see any examples on your campus, were examples of where there have been actual free speech controversies where attempts to shout down or shut down and deplatform speakers or to punish faculty members or students for engaging in controversial expression. And according to this report, there were no such incidents on your campus. Can I just say something else about, because this ties into the tragic assassination last week. The fire survey had come out one day before Charlie Kirk was shot. And in fire's press release that announced the results, one of the points that it stressed was a dismaying increase in what had already been a disturbingly high percentage of students who said that it is at least sometimes acceptable to use violence as a tactic for silencing a speaker that you don't want to hear. Last year, that number was something like 25%, and this year it went up to 34%. And another dismaying aspect is that number is becoming more and more bipartisan. In the past, it had been mostly students who described themselves as strong Democrats who were more supportive of violence as at least sometimes being an acceptable tactic. And now, this year, strong Republicans actually slightly exceeded strong Democrats in saying that it's sometimes acceptable. So that was and so the day before Charlie Kirk is shot, in Fire's press release, Sean Stevens, the person who was responsible for this report, singled out that factor. And he said, this is neither a Democratic problem nor a Republican problem. This is an American problem. And that was so sadly prophetic.
We have about 45 or 50 minutes for questions, but our group asked, as I mentioned before, we wanted to give opportunities for a couple of student leaders on campus to ask questions. And James Wilson is a master's candidate in public administration and the head of the Student Government Association.
That's my genre. Well, thank you so much for being here. Oh, yes, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I had the pleasure of meeting you and speaking to you earlier, and I told you that I was interested in education. And so that relates to my question. What is the right age, or when is the right time to start teaching students about free speech?
As soon as they enter school.
I thought so, because so many of us as students, we come to college ill-equipped to handle perspectives that differ from our own. So not only when is it appropriate to start teaching students, but how do you teach younger students about free speech?
Oh, fabulous question, James. And I'm so happy that you're going to apply your talents and your great education you're getting here to educational policy. As a nice coincidence, a couple of weeks ago, I got to speak at an in through 12 school. Please forgive me, I had never heard that concept. I was familiar with K through 12, but you all know that it's nursery school through 12. And this was the famous laboratory schools at the University of Chicago, which University of Chicago is so associated with academic freedom and free speech. We have the Chicago free speech principles. We have the Calvin principles on institutional neutrality. John Dewey, whom you probably know through your educational studies, great educator, was the founder of the Chicago Lab Schools, and they were based on the notion that freedom of speech and academic freedom have to be instilled as values and as habits and as skills starting at the earliest ages. So prior to going there, I looked at the materials they have, which are incredible. They divide the students into about 5 or 6 tranches by grade level, but starting with N. And on every single vector, including open inquiry and viewpoint diversity and civil discourse and respectful listening, right? That's another important part of free speech that we don't get as much training in as we should. Every single one. There was a chart where they broke down at each one of those levels, starting with the earliest level, age appropriate, interesting and engaging pedagogical approaches to instill, to empower those students to not only understand and respect free speech, but to exercise and engage with others in exercising free speech. 2 days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a phenomenal op-ed, which I highly recommend to all of you, by Barbara Oakley, who's a neuroscientist and who is one of a growing number who have studied the actual impact on the brain of either the presence or the absence of free speech and all of the associated values and skills that we've been talking about. And we know that the brain is remarkably plastic, right? And studies show, I mean, brain imaging and other studies show that people who live in sensorial societies or societies where they don't have the opportunity to exercise free speech, that the brain actually changes shape and becomes less able to be receptive to dissonant ideas and perspectives. But conversely, thanks to the plasticity, education and training certainly can start putting the brain in the right direction. I'm not using the scientific terms here, or can counteract censorship. But based on neuroscience, she is advocating that we can't start early enough. And let me just put in a little plug here, since you asked about materials. Barbara has designed a wonderful Coursera, one of those mass online courses about critical inquiry that does include the traditional free speech type arguments made by, among others, my colleague from FIRE, Greg Luciano, but also explaining the neuroscience approach. And she's won awards for how engaging and captivating her courses are. She's now in the process of trying to get the resources to develop an equivalent course, but for young students.
James, right behind you is Jennifer McCoy, a professor of political science, and she also has an affiliation with the Center of Human Rights and Democracy.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks.
We also got to meet before you.
Oh, good.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I research. I research political polarization and democratic backsliding and slides toward authoritarianism. And in the countries I have been in, I've seen the effects of government control on free speech in the media, in the society, and in universities, which is extremely worrisome. So here, the First Amendment is to protect us against government repression of speech and to allow dissent. So my question is that we also know that political rhetoric of leaders, besides democracy, can incite dialogues among highly aggressive individuals who may be inspired not only by online communities that people are worried about, but actually by political rhetoric by leaders whom they admire. So should we have different standards of speech for people in responsible positions, primarily in the government, political leaders who may be already elected officials, but they may be out of government, they may be political leaders out of government and not yet elected. And we have primarily relied on political norms to, hold them, but when those norms break down, should we have different standards? And if so, for their speech, and if so, how could we enforce them?
Excellent question, an important question, Jennifer. And the answer is we should not have different standards, but the standards, because the standards we already have are very contextual, are very fact specific. And one of the pertinent facts is who is the speaker and what is the likely impact of that particular speaker. So the example that you were referring to is potentially inciting violence, as you well know, but I'll tell the rest of the audience here. In the United States, since 1969, we have had what I consider to be, more importantly, the U.S. Supreme Court considers to be the appropriately strict standard for speech that may be punished because of its triggering of a violent or unlawful response. The case was called Brandenburg versus Ohio. It was an ACLU case, I'm proud to say. Not only was that decided unanimously, but it has been supported by every single justice who has subsequently sat on the court, despite the enormous difference among all of those many justices ideologically. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, and it used the adjective mere in front of advocacy, mere advocacy of violent or unlawful conduct can never be punished. Think about that. You know, you can literally say, I think that Charlie Kirk should be killed. I think that people who denigrate Charlie Kirk should be killed. That's, this may get me in trouble on social media, even for repeating it as to illustrate a point here, but it could not be legally punished. When it crosses the line, a number of factors, but they're very fact specific, have to be satisfied. The speaker has to, first of all, be targeting an individual or small group of individuals and intentionally incite, hold up my fingers this way, intentionally incite, so the verb incite is used as stronger than advocate, imminent violent or lawless conduct that is likely to actually happen imminently. And certainly it would be a relevant factor if the speaker, it doesn't necessarily have to be a political elected officials. Charlie Kirk apparently was an extremely influential and charismatic figure, so that can be taken into account if somebody was accusing him of instigating violence. Interestingly enough, there have been a number of court rulings about our current president who has been accused of violating the Brandenburg Standard, both on January 6th, and there was also a case that arose during his first presidential campaign during a rally, I believe it was in 2016, somewhere in the Midwest. Forgive me, I'm from the Midwest, so I should remember which exact state it was. But there were some counter demonstrators, anti-Trump demonstrators, and he said to some of his supporters, get him out of here, get him out of here. And some of his supporters, physically pushed out the anti-Trump demonstrators who alleged that they suffered some assault and they were injured. And of course, they can bring an assault charge or civil action against those who did physically assault them. But they also complained that Trump should be liable under this standard. And the judge in that case appropriately considered every single fact, including the powerful position that Trump exercised, his powerful influence over his enthusiastic supporters. But he also said, the very last thing that he said was, don't hurt him. And he did something similar on January 6th, you may remember. After a lot of over-the-top rhetoric, he said something like, go in peace, peacefully. So I think he was very well advised by his lawyers, and indeed, with a thumb on the scales in favor of free speech, that was not seen as satisfying the standard. Now, I always like to give people a counterexample here, because I don't want whatever your views are about Donald Trump and what he said should not affect your analysis here, because it applies to people with very different messages at the very same time, almost about the same time as January 6th. the ACLU was representing a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, DeRay McKesson, in the United States Supreme Court, because he had given a very, vituperative and, inflammatory and impassioned and incendiary speech against police officers who had engaged in violence and who had killed black men. This was in Louisiana. And at that rally where he was giving this heated talk, somebody threw a rock and hit a police officer and injured the police officer. Unfortunately, they never caught the person who actually threw the rock, who clearly would be culpable. But DeRay McKesson and the Black Lives Matter organization were found culpable for instigation in the lower court. That was actually upheld. So the ACLU represented him on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And fortunately, we got that overturned because, again, the Supreme Court, was strictly enforcing this Brandenburg test. And I remember at the time I was being interviewed by a Wall Street Journal reporter, and again, with admirable terseness, he boiled down my long-winded law professor answer, and he said, so what you're basically saying is what's good for DeRay McKesson is good for Trump and vice versa. And I said, yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Jennifer, 2 rows behind you is Andrew I. Cohen, not to be confused with Andrew J. Cohen. They're both philosophy professors.
Thanks for the presentation, and I find it very compelling. I'm wondering how you might respond to a critic who might raise a concern about the defense that you were giving
Please.
about free speech. And at one point you were saying that this defense of civil liberties is important because it seems like it's the least bad of the options that are available. And as you said, and I'm paraphrasing loosely, please correct me if I get it wrong, having the government do it would be far worse. Mm-hmm. I accept that and I find that compelling. But I can imagine a critic worrying that pressing that type of a defense of free speech is inherently unstable and it's very fragile because it's offering a type of instrumental defense of free speech. Mm-hmm. And it's vulnerable to a response that we've got the technique, we've got the bot, we've got the smart person, we have the committee, we have this procedure that would allow us to ferret out the bad speech and we're going to run with it. And the critic might then say, perhaps an alternative would not be to make some sort of a consequentialist argument, but to appeal to some rights on the part of the parties who would be speaking. And that rights-based defense, they might say, could be a more secure and more stable way of approaching a defense of civil liberties. And I'm curious how you would respond to a critic worried about that instrumentalist approach.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Andrew. And that is a very serious argument, and I'm not a philosopher, as I've said, so I'm answering only as with my experience in law and as an advocate. But from a legal perspective, free speech and other civil liberties are not absolute. Yes, they are very important values and very important principles, but they do not automatically trump other concerns. And so in that sense, it seems to me you always have to make some kind of judgment, I guess you can call it. I don't see how you can escape an instrumentalist judgment of, maybe you would call it utilitarianism. What is the greatest good? Balancing the value of liberty versus the costs of liberty, which are the risks of liberty, which are definitely there. By the way, this came up this week when people were saying, Charlie Kirk was defending the Second Amendment, and he famously said before he was killed that I recognize that there are risks to people exercising their Second Amendment rights. And one of my friends wrote an op-ed and said that's the same point that we make about the First Amendment. We realize that there are risks. We realize that there are harms, but and that those have to be taken into account. And sometimes, by the way, I haven't said this explicitly yet, Andrew, sometimes that warrants restricting the speech if the speech can satisfy the Brandenburg test. It's a hard test, but it's not an impossible test. If the speech is a targeted true threat or intimidation, not only does that cause physical harm, but it also has a speech suppressive impact. So to some extent, you have to do this consequentialist balancing even in deciding what the permissible scope of free speech is. That said, I fully support, at least as a matter of rhetoric and abstract belief, what I consider to be one of the most eloquent defenses of free speech in our jurisprudence, and that is a concurring opinion by Louis Brandeis in Whitney versus California. And he starts by saying free speech has both an inherent value, an intrinsic value, and an instrumental value. And he seems to base his support, very strong support, but not absolute support for free speech on both of them as independently sufficient grounds. And yet, in that very same opinion, and also in that very same opinion, he crafts the emergency principle that if in a particular context the speech does present an emergency that can only be countered by reducing the speech, restricting the speech, then that restriction is justified. But I'd love to hear your rebuttal to that.
This isn't so much a rebuttal, but I think what you're saying is, I find it compelling. So it could be a complement to the instrumentalist account. And somebody could also give a rights-based defense of free speech and say the right has to be qualified or understood as having a certain scope. So it's consistent with the defense that you're offering. It's just a different type of approach.
Framing it differently, yeah.
Indeed.
Thank you.
I have a related question.
What's your name, please?
Peter Lindsay.
Peter.
And I'm a colleague of this guy's, and we often say the same things.
Which department are you both?
Philosophy and political
Oh,
science.
philosophy. There we are, yeah.
So I want to go back to the instrumentalist case because to reiterate what Andrew said, that you said that there are problems with free speech, but it may be the best approach that we can do, better than the others, better than government involvement. But there's a huge middle ground between, as you would call it, a censorial society in North Korea and a free speech society. And as you know, the United States is actually an outlier on the protection, the permissibility of hate speech, for instance. So I have a hard time calling Canada and Germany censorial societies or societies that don't respect free speech. In fact, I think that they do a good job in looking at all of society and protecting other related values. To give you one example, most universities have policies about what we professors can say in the classroom. And they're completely justified because we're concerned about other important rights. The right to be in a classroom that's not charged, that's not discriminatory in some way, that doesn't use language that denies students the right to education. And so I'm quite happy to have my speech monitored and restricted in a certain way. And I think that argument could carry on to society at large. There are great advantages that Germany and that Canada, and just to list two, gain from limiting Holocaust denying or other acts. And I can see you wincing. But again, can we at least say that the claim that this is the best way is an empirical claim that has to stand the test of comparative politics, and it's not clear that the U.S. wins. And again, emphasize that we are the outlier here.
I agree with everything that you say, except that it's not clear that the U.S. wins. I don't know I've been in those other countries. I'm constantly following incidents of censorship there, incidents of self-censorship there. I'm constantly dealing with free speech organizations, including academic freedom organizations in these countries. And Peter, I truly would not want to live in one of those countries. I enjoy visiting them, but the examples are just a legion. I mean, Canada, for example, Canadians have been subject to criminal penalty. Faculty members have been subject to criminal prosecution for saying something that is unpopular. You know, here in this country, we have too much, but believe me, my concern is that we don't have enough free speech in this country, and we're moving closer in that direction. Holocaust denial, I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I read historians of the Holocaust, including Deborah Lipstadt, who was in the Biden administration, the ambassador against against anti-Semitism. She and all the other leading Holocaust scholars completely oppose outlawing Holocaust denial because they say that suppresses the debate and information and discussion and keeping it live and in front of people. And in Germany, I'm very concerned about that. That's where my father is from, and I still have relatives there. And if you've followed what's happened with the kind of indoctrinating education that they have about what purports to be educational, to me, indoctrination is the opposite of education. But surveys show that the students just reject it. You know, the way I rejected mandatory passive sex education when I was a kid. You know, it just becomes this pat formula that and you don't really grapple with it the way that you do. You know, like I love the kind of question that I got from Andrew. I love getting challenges to my ideas. First of all, if my ideas are wrong, I want to know it. But that kind of debate is necessary to keep the information alive. So Holocaust denial is a particular example, but Germany is so strict that any reference to Nazism, any use of hate speech, even if it is for the purpose of calling it out, is criminally prosecuted. One example recently from Cologne, because Germany likes to say we're dealing with anti-Semitism, and they do a lot. I give them a lot of credit for that. A local rabbi posted something on social media about, you know, he was retweeting, or somebody asked me recently, do we still use the verb tweet when it's now called X? He was re-Xing a virulently anti-Semitic post that somebody had put up with the comment, see, anti-Semitism is still very much alive in Germany. And then the mayor of that town also reposted it and said, you know, we're going to redouble our efforts to counter anti-Semitism. And both of them were prosecuted. And the prosecutor literally said, and you know, there are so many examples like this in all of these countries, and journalists will tell you that they engage in self-censorship. Public opinion survey in Germany showed something like 80% of people say that they feel that they can't discuss in any public place any controversial issue. In Britain, they have police or what do they call it? There's some euphemism, a non-crime bias offense, where police officers are going to people's homes and making arrests. It's like the bias reporting system that we have on some campuses, but that's nationwide in the UK. And it's now, some of these have been very well publicized recently. It's now reached a point where members of the public and members of the judiciary and police are turning against it. They're saying, we have serious crime problems here. We don't need to be creating thought crimes.
I agree with everything you say, but let me just offer, if we're going to look at the ledger here, though, we also have to include some of the negative aspects of American society that are owing explicitly to our permissiveness. Yeah. So on the negative side for Germany and Canada are the things you point out to, but let's include the negative side of the United States. You've pointed out how much of a chilling effect we already have in the United States, and add to that the much higher levels of violence against groups that happens in the United States. So I get it. There are problems in Germany and Canada, but there are certainly huge problems in the United States that make it not just an outlier in free speech, but an outlier in the problems associated with free speech.
Yeah, but Peter, you're complicating it, which is how can we zero in on the role that speech plays as opposed to our absence of gun laws and all kinds of other factors.
On campus, because, and this might be a slight criticism against Georgia State, I love the school, Panther down, but most of the statements that came out during the Israel-Gaza conflict and the protests, were neutral, but the actions that followed were not. And I see that the ACLU sent out an open letter encouraging a lot of universities to not persecute or not intimidate students that stood for Palestine.
The rules must be enforced even-handedly in a content-neutral way. And we've had a lot, when I say we, I mean the ACLU and FIRE organizations that protect students' free speech and protest rights. We've had complaints from all sides, some complaints that pro-Palestinian speech is being disproportionately censored, some that pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist speech is being disproportionately censored. Either one would violate the First Amendment. Does that answer your question?
It kind of does, but I guess what I'm thinking more about is even in adherence to these policies, university administrations very rarely remain completely neutral. So I'm specifically thinking about people that have been censored because of what they've said, but there has been no proof or evidence to show that they've directly gone against policy. So it's when that type of censorship happens on college campus.
That would be illegal. That would be unconstitutional on a city university campus. If you can show that the reason for the censorship of the message was dislike of the idea or the discriminatory enforcement, that violates the First Amendment. Let me give you an example. A controversial case that the ACLU handled a few years ago, 2017 to be precise. Remember the Unite the Right demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia? The Unite the Right demonstrators who were opposing the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in a park in Charlottesville, they had gotten a permit to have a demonstration protesting the removal of the statue. They had gotten the permit like months and months in advance, and counter demonstrators also got a permit something like less than a week, a few days before the demonstration was going to take place. The city council in Charlottesville revoked the parade permit for the demonstrators, and the ACLU represented Unite the Right because the only reason that was given for removing the permit had nothing to do with public safety. The chief of police testified that we've got the situation under control, we've monitored it, there are no plans for violence at all, and if there are, we're completely prepared to deal with it. I mean, tragically, we now know that was not true, but that's what was said in the trial. There was no basis for not believing it. And city council members testified that the reason they were revoking the permit was because they hated the ideas of Unite the Right. Well, I hate their ideas too, but that is viewpoint discrimination, regardless of what their views were, regardless of whether they were hated or loved or loathed by the city council. That was not a justification for taking away the permit. If there had, the police had been doing the job and seen, and I don't mean to be overly critical, but there was a report afterwards that was highly critical. But if they had the evidence that the reason for revoking it was because of violence, not because of disapproval of the message, that would have been okay. So if students are being selectively punished, not because they're engaging in violent or disruptive protest activity, but because their messages are less favored, that would be unconstitutional.
Perfect. And how can students protect their First Amendment rights in college campuses? Because we do a lot of conversations. I don't know if you've heard about the USA.
Yes, I know it I know when it was founded. I'm old enough to remember that back in Berkeley. Yeah.
So a lot of the challenges that we have in our meetings, because it's amongst college students, is a lot of people don't know how to advocate for their First Amendment rights and how to use it. So how can, I guess, how can we as college organizations reach out to students and to remind them to use their First Amendment rights and to, say what they need to say?
Amen. I mean, you answered your own question, which is information, education, inspiration, serving as a role model. And in some ways, it goes back to your question, James, and we're continuing the education at the university level, or maybe even starting at the university level. And this is why Bridge USA is so important, because it is not just a matter of knowing in the abstract what the rights are, but exercising them and developing the ability to exercise them. No right is self-enforcing. And this is, people are kind of surprised when they hear this. So rights, the default is that rights will be violated, because that's the tendency of government, is to exercise power. And if people do, and I'm not saying that critically, I'm sure that the people in government, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, they're devoting their lives to public service because they want to help the public, and they think that what they're doing is for the public good. And I give that presumption to university leaders as well. So there has to be, a checking, right, of those who say, well, but we know what our rights are, and we insist that and we know when they're being violated, and we're going to take steps to make sure that they are protected. Most of, I have to tell you, not only is the First Amendment violated every day, constantly, but the same is true of the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause, and that's why organizations like the NAACP and the ACLU and many, many others were founded, number one, to inform people what their rights are. Number two, let them know that there are lawyers there to advocate on their behalf. And I have spoken to students on campuses who said that FIRE and Heterodox and ACLU should do a better job of advertising, that if they knew that there were these organizations that would back them up in their rights, that would have been very helpful. But you obviously know that. And these are resources that hopefully you won't need to use. Hopefully you can, just by asserting your rights, have them respected. But in the worst case scenario, you've got lawyers to back you up in a lawsuit. Oh, I'm never going to be invited back to this campus.
We have time for a lot of hands up. We have about 10 minutes if you want to go over, I guess, just a bit. That might be okay. I say 3 hands, but can we maybe keep the answers quick to try to get
I'm
rid of the
so
last
sorry.
three?
I'm so
it's not
sorry.
bad.
Yeah, no, why don't I take several questions in a row, and
Okay.
that way I'll shorten my answers. But let me get a pen.
We've got 10 minutes.
So I'm going to throw in a real quick question, speech adjacent. I've been puzzled why private campuses don't want to just elect people in their tents that are protesting overnight. Why bother? Like, why not just leave them there? And I guess some of them use the pretense of safety,
Yeah.
but it doesn't strike me that that's really plausible. Like, these campuses are generally pretty safe that we're talking about. So why not just let them stay and keep their protests up?
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. A couple of years ago at Yale, they have this famous debate, Yale Political Union, and the debate proposition, I guess it was a year ago, the debate proposition was something like encampments should be banned, and they let me choose.
Feel free to take books as you're leaving, by the way.
Thanks again, James, thank you. And they let me choose which side, and I said, no, I think encampments should not be categorically banned. They should be subject to content neutral time, place, and manner regulations. And again, to your excellent question, that it's very context specific. So in a place like Columbia, which is a tiny urban campus, you might have to, extremely severely, to the point of extinction, restrict them, because they're so disruptive to getting to and from your classes. But a place like Cornell, with sprawling, and the president there did allow encampments in a very prominent part of campus because it was so big. The ACLU, I have to disclose, the one Supreme Court decision on overnight camping was an ACLU case. Unfortunately, we lost it, but we were advocating for the right of a group that was advocated on behalf of homeless, unhoused people, that they should have the right to sleep overnight in the major park in Washington, D.C., to demonstrate the plight of homelessness and generate sympathy for it. We got 4 votes.
So
We're going to take several questions.
All right, I'm so sorry, so sorry. Thank you, that's very smart. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So thank you so much. I'm assistant professor, political science, Zhang. So I have a very quick question. So first, thank you so much for all of your lifetime service on this issue. So since you asked a question to political scientists, we should go over correlation, to causation. So I was wondering, because I do my own research, read all the data, very empirical. So we should go over the single linking, but just specific data or measures that are used to construct the linking. So I'm not sure if all researchers can access on the website. Yes, thank you.
Could you, and when you walk back, there's a woman in the back who's done her hand up for a long time.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I understood the comment.
Yeah, so you did some survey or
Yeah.
collecting data.
Yeah.
So how much detailed data each research
Oh, okay.
can do? I mean, so just
Okay,
curious.
great.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Noor. I'm a master's student in the political science department. I'll try to make my question pretty brief. But in regard to what Reddy said, and I was hoping to ask right after her, since it was going to piggyback off of it, in cases where the university outright denies complaints of limiting of free speech, for example, when I graduated from my bachelor's here at GSU, both me and my family were I was told that I was going to get my degree taken away from me for wearing my kufiya, which is like a Palestinian scarf on stage. And my family was told to return to their cars and put it back, or else they wouldn't be allowed to come into the venue. And when we talked to the university about that, it was outright denied by email to the public as well. So in cases where things like that happen, where should students go in order to be listened to and not told that they're telling false stories?
That's it? Nobody else?
Mike, what about the book? That's what I didn't read to get
Bye.
Hello. So another question that I sort of have.
What's your name?
Oh, Matt. Oh, I forgot for a minute. So professional Max.
Hi.
And I had a question specifically about when governments impose laws about free speech. I was thinking that if there's a will, there's a way, and if they're going to impose laws on free speech, wouldn't that cause further dissent, and couldn't that be used as ammunition to further radicalize or encourage polarization? And I'm just wondering, like, that's a thing.
Could you repeat that, or I'm not sure I get it.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Don't, that's my fault.
What I was thinking is that if governments impose limits on freedom of speech, like we see in Canada or like we see in Germany, would that further add fuel to? Could that be used as evidence for already existing radical parties to be further? Would that be used as further like evidence?
Got it. I'm so sorry.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Lisa. Okay, so if I understood your question, Professor, you were asking about the fire surveying data, and that is completely available on the website to the best of my knowledge. If there's any further data, you could certainly get it from the staff, and they are so eager to share the data and to have other people look at it and analyze it and make suggestions for improvement, either as to particular campuses or more generally. It's kind of this collaborative, open source, open debate. So thank you for your interest. And if you have any trouble, I think the contact information is available, but I can also provide it. Noor, I don't know what the rationale that was given that you weren't allowed to wear the kufiya. Was there some content neutral rule against any kind of garb, any kind of, that maybe that's the question that was being asked by Reddy. Was there some general rule that you were allegedly violating?
Earlier that day, there was a ceremony where a student has taken up a flag while they were walking on stage. And after that, I was under the impression that the university tries to crack down on taking flags up to the stage. But there was nothing about scarves or other things of the kind. The flags are walking are charged to have, say, cultural symbols that
Well, it would be one thing if there were a general rule of which was being enforced with respect to all kinds of garb. and maybe, just for the sake of uniformity or non-disruption, we want every student to be wearing just the official graduation regalia. But if there's discriminatory enforcement, that becomes a source of viewpoint discrimination, and you could certainly report it to fire to investigate and counsel as appropriate. But the devil is in the details, depending on the actual policy and the actual enforcement. But whatever the policy was, it certainly should have been announced clearly. Otherwise, there's a due process violation if people aren't clearly notified in advance of what the rules are. Max, your question is an excellent question. And in fact, you're pointing to yet another, I'm thinking of Andrew, another downside of censorship is that it does in fact create free speech martyrs. It does draw a lot of attention to the person who's being censored. This happened in the Germany leading up to the rise of the Nazi Party. People say, oh, if only Hitler had been censored, then we wouldn't have had the Holocaust. In fact, there were very strict anti-hate speech laws in Germany, very similar to the ones they have now. And the Nazis loved it. The show trial or the trials became platforms, propaganda platforms for them that got them a lot of attention and a lot of sympathy. And this is why a lot of campus provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos and others welcome attempts to shout them down and shut them down, because they get attention and inevitably some sympathy that they otherwise wouldn't have.
We're just a little bit past time, so I want to thank you once again for coming to our campus. Okay. Goodbye.